Welcome back. My name is Damon Stanwell-Smith from the consultancy NIRAS, and I'm going to be facilitating the next two sessions that we're running, one before lunch and one after lunch. And if you've seen in your programs, it is going to be sessions discussing MSP in a cross-border context. So and this is a study that I'm going to be explaining further imminently, and it's been funded by the European Commission. But it does have a sort of international context that we're very looking forward to sharing with you. And there's a number of speakers. You'll see that there's going to be a number of speakers in the morning and again in the afternoon. So there's going to be a little bit of choreography of getting speakers to the lectern at different times. So I hope you'll bear with us on that. I'm going to take my facilitator's hat on and put my project manager of this study on, and I'm just going to give a little introduction for the lectern. So the study I'm going to discuss is a study that has the official title on International Best Practices for Cross-Border MSP. Because there is the European description of maritime spatial planning, and then there is the sort of the international marine spatial planning, rather than that mouthful being said, I think throughout we'll be using the acronym MSP throughout, just to avoid having to say 4 words every time. And so I'm going to just give a short introduction, and it's just to sort of give a scene setter, and I'm going to rely on the technical content from the experts that are arrayed before us. So the aim of this study was originally conceived to assist the EC and member states, European member states, in the implementation of the EC MSP directive, as it was highlighted yesterday. Through the identification of good practices in MSP around sort of international examples. And this is a focus on cross-border cooperation, and I'm going to discuss further cross-border, the word cross-border and how we've interpreted, because it's very relevant to the way that we've done this work. And then also to develop recommendations to support the promotion of information and sort of knowledge exchange at an international scale. Now, this study was tendered and was sort of originally conceived 3 years ago, and with the sort of evolving agenda on international ocean governance, we'll also highlight how the work we're doing is looking to support the broader work that the European Commission is doing on ocean governance. And the first point I'd like to make is actually in the title. I know it's semantics of what's in a name. If you think about what best practice is, you get some ideas and you put them together and you have what could be considered the best idea. And we begged the European Commission's indulgence when we started working on this study a year ago and suggested that we should be looking at good practices rather than best practice. Speakers highlighted this yesterday as well, this idea that there is sort of contextual issues, that things, one size does not necessarily fit all. But certainly in one of the outcomes that's come from this project is very much the case that there is good ideas being highlighted all over the world. And we have looked at a series of case studies of MSP and spatial planning more broadly that has occurred around the world, where there are some really interesting lessons that could be brought that will be very relevant to the EC and beyond. The second point on the semantics of the title is the word cross-border. So we have defined cross-border cooperation as being across jurisdictions, as opposed to singly across sovereign borders. This is because there has been some very relevant lessons and very interesting successes around the world that we've found through our case studies, where different jurisdictional borders, which have been very much the relevant MSP planning units, whether it be a hierarchy of different nested levels or whether of similar levels of jurisdiction but adjacent, that we feel that have been very relevant. And so that does expand the opportunity of looking at cross-jurisdictional MSP, but it's also meant that there has been maybe a more rich discussion and more rich opportunities for looking for possibilities for good practice. Now, the study has been broken down into 4 main areas. In the first instance, we were asked to compile an inventory of MSP going on around the world internationally that was not already in a European context, that has been gathered separately from another study the EC has funded. with an emphasis on the cross-border nature. And this work, in turn, has been very much informed by a study that was funded by the UN Environment and by Jeff Stapp, which is called the MSP in Practice study. So that was one of the projects that where a lot of information that we very gratefully received from UN Environment. And there have been other studies as well. We're going to be discussing that shortly, about how that was compiled. Secondly, we were asked to look at 4 international case studies, and I'm going to highlight those in a moment. Thirdly, we've been putting lessons to learn together. And then fourthly, originally, this study was going to be hosting a meeting in Brussels solely to discuss this project. And this big conference that is running now has evolved from that original project. So also we have had a role in assisting in the coordination of this conference as well. And then finally, the reports are the final report for the study is being compiled as we speak, and the final draft is going to be submitted in a few weeks' time. We're going to take this opportunity at the conference also for those that, if there's any comments, substantive input or whatever, we'll pick up from the discussions as well as the sort of the final input into the study, with a view that it will be completed in May, so in 2 months' time. Now, the study inevitably is not solely from one organization. I just wanted to give a little bit of a sort of logo field here of looking at the different entities that have been involved to work together in order to bring this work to fruition. So initially there's the project management side, which from myself and my colleagues from a NIRAS perspective. And also NIRAS has done a lot of work on global offshore wind and also on MSP evaluations. So I have a colleague here as well, Gonzalo Cañero from our Swedish office, who will be discussing from an evaluation point of view as well. We involved the UN Environment's World Conservation Monitoring Center because, despite the title, it is actually the UN's biodiversity center that supports the UN Environment specifically and the UN family more broadly on biodiversity issues. But there is a rich amount of expertise there around MSP, and so we want to bring in their expertise in that respect. We looked at Law of the Sea. We used the World Maritime University's experts to provide some governance advice. And also, we had a specialist event planning organization, a company called QED. So behind the scenes, the QED have been very much supporting this conference, and we're very grateful for the support they've provided us. In terms of regional expertise, the 4 case studies, which I'm going to highlight in a moment, but you may be able to have a hint just from the names and the attributions of the regional bodies that have been supporting us. We've had the University of Rhode Island's Coastal Resources Center. We've had the Nature Conservancy, and specifically in the support of the Coral Triangle Initiative. We've had the South Atlantic Environmental Research Institute, and also expertise from the Commission on the Convention on the on CAMLA, I should say, and also University of Xiamen's College of Environment and Ecology. We also have an advisory group which has got various luminaries that some of which are sitting here, who have provided, we call this a synthesis panel, but this was a body where we're looking at the recommendations, and certainly their attributions and expertise have been very useful in the study. The one person that listed there that's not here today is Professor Eric Molenaar from the Netherlands Institute from the Law of the Sea, who's also provided some additional sort of legal governance advice on our compiling of a final report. So where are the 4 case studies? So when we were reflecting to think about how to approach the Commission, to think what would be most relevant, most useful for a study like this, we, in the first instance, looked at the inventory that had been compiled by UN Environment and Jeff Stapp. And there were 4 standout studies, 4 standout locations that we felt were doing very interesting work for different reasons, and I'm going to touch on that in a moment. Firstly, looking at Rhode Island, USA, then in Xiamen, the eastern seaboard of China, looking at the multilateral arrangements across the Coral Triangle Initiative in Southeast Asia, and then looking at the Southern Oceans, specifically looking at the work of CAMLA. So those little pictures there, this is just a taster. I appreciate they're pretty small on the screen here, but they're going to be looked at in depth at the studies we have. Look at the presentations we have on the 4 case studies. So these are the specific areas: the Special Area Management Plan from Rhode Island, the marine functional zoning in China, the Coral Triangle Initiative on coral reef fisheries and food security in the Coral Triangle region, and then specifically the Camelot body in the Southern Ocean. The question is why we selected these. Now, I'm going to distill this down to just a word or two, but will be very much elaborated upon in the presentations to come. So we were very interested from the Rhode Island perspective of the MSP that's being done, has been undertaken there, very much driven by the development of offshore wind. And we're conscious that this is also a driver of a lot of MSP going on in Europe. We felt there may be some interesting lessons to be sort of learned across the two entities and the two geographies. From a Xiamen point of view, as we've heard yesterday, marine functional zoning has been going on for a long time now, and there's been great success in that. And we wanted to drill down and understand the nuances of success around the sort of reducing sea use conflict in areas where there's a lot of marine activity, and also this novel use of sea use fees, which I think is of great interest to a European context. From the Coral Triangle, with the 6 countries of the Coral Triangle that you can see listed here: Indonesia, Malaysia, Papua New Guinea, Philippines, Solomon Islands, and Timor-Leste, that there's been a really strong multilateral partnership that we feel has been very interesting in the way that different MSPs across borders can be planned in a hierarchical level. And then also looking from the Southern Ocean point of view, there is great success over 30 years of looking at ecosystem-based management in the Southern Ocean. And because of the unique nature of the Southern Ocean, it's also relevance to looking at high seas as well. So there are some interesting lessons that came out of understanding sort of how one might explore MSP in the high seas in a Southern Ocean context, as was mentioned by Charles in the opening address. So you've got us for the next 4 hours, and this is just a little tasters of the things that we're going to be covering. So we're going to have a presentation on the global examples of cross-border collaboration MSP, and I'd hope that afterwards you'll see that maybe the cupboard isn't quite so bare as maybe we were initially thinking in terms of examples of cross-border collaboration. Secondly, we're going to be looking at context, and no doubt you'll hear the discussion about drivers in context in MSP. It comes up all the time about the contextual nature of all spatial planning, and we'll be sharing our thoughts on that in the context of this study. So then we're going to be looking at collaboration and participation. I'd just like to make this point. It's sort of like, if you like, we're trying to present a matrix of information. We are either going to present specific geographies or specific themes. So what we have decided to do is to present a theme illustrated by one each of the 4 case studies. And there's going to be a little bit of a choreography because the regional expert is going to be presenting from the case study perspective, and then we'll invite one of the other people from the consortium are going to also talk about looking across the case studies from their working in the evaluation across the different case studies over the last year. So we're going to be looking at collaboration and participation, and then the ecosystem approach. We'll then have lunch. I trust you'll all be keen to stop listening to us. So have a break for 60 minutes. And as I said at the beginning, please, at 58 minutes, feel that urge to come back and continue listening. We have then 3 more talks in the afternoon. We're going to be looking at the hierarchy of MSP planning, illustrated by the Xiamen Marine Functional Zoning. We're going to look at effective monitoring and evaluation, as illustrated by the Coral Triangle Initiative. And then we're going to endeavour to bring it all together to distill out elements of good practice that have been very much drawn from those case studies. And then finally, we have 30 minutes of questions and answers. I'm going to invite all of the speakers up, so we'll all be here. And that's the point at which building up those Slido questions. So I'd encourage those Slido questions to come forward and to accrue so that we have a rich discussion at that time. So as I said, that's the opportunity to interact, and we very much look forward to doing that. So that's the plan. And now I do hope you'll sit back and have a think and enjoy hearing about this study that has been, from my perspective, a very, very interesting study over the last year. And if you like, one of the things, I don't want to raise expectation here, but the key element that we had thought when we set off on this, that we would try to drill down and find recommendations and lessons that were beyond the very simple points of just saying, stakeholder engagement is good, or money is needed, or MSP is helpful. So we were looking to try to draw out things that are substantive and maybe novel, and I'd hope that at the end of this, that, and certainly in the Q&A we'll see, that these case studies do represent some very interesting new ways of thinking about cross-border collaboration in the context of MSP. So thank you very much from me. I'm now going to put back my facilitator's hat back on, and I'm going to be inviting up to the stage two of our team. We're going to invite Steve Fletcher, who is the Marine Head of the UN Environment World Conservation Monitoring Centre. And I'm going to invite Stephen Olson, who is the Director Emeritus of the University of Rhode Island's Coastal Resources Centre, who are going to be talking about the global inventory that we've been undertaking. Steve?
Thank you, Damon, and good morning, everybody. So our initial exploration of cross-border cooperation in MSP was undertaken through the compilation of an inventory of existing MSP processes existing outside of Europe. The inventory itself has four purposes. First of all, to provide an up-to-date assessment of MSP processes, especially those exhibiting cross-border characteristics. Secondly, to enable the identification of common cross-border cooperation practices. Thirdly, to provide the context for the four detailed case studies that Damon has just touched upon. And fourthly, to highlight any methodological or analytical approaches that will support how we would approach the analysis of the case studies. Our approach to compiling the inventory was not to reinvent the wheel. We sought to collate relevant information from existing lists and databases of MSP processes. 3 existing listings were used, as you can see on the screen, which were supplemented by a review of relevant literature to fill any gaps. As each of these listings used slightly different definitions, slightly different approaches, we decided to apply a filter to them to draw out case studies and examples that were specifically relevant to this study. The criteria that were used, which we called inclusion criteria, there were 6 of them, and they were derived from the definition of marine spatial planning included in the MSP directive. So as such, all MSP processes included in the directive would aim to achieve ecological, economic, and social objectives. They would apply the ecosystem approach. They would include multiple marine sectors, at least 2. They would aim to improve the coherence between MSP and other processes. It's something we heard about yesterday. How does MSP link to integrated coastal management or MPA networks? The processes in the inventory would have some degree of stakeholder involvement, and of course they would make use of spatial data. And of course we were also looking for non-European examples, so that immediately knocked out quite a lot from the inventories that previously existed. So having applied those criteria, the number of MSP processes in red were included in the inventory from each of those sources. Before the inventory itself was assessed or evaluated, any remaining data gaps that we had were filled, where possible, by bespoke searches and discussions with experts and people involved in those MSP processes. The data themselves were then verified by sending extracts of the inventory to the people involved in the MSP processes for them to check the data and that we were using, and the data we were using was correct. The resulting composite inventory contains 62 non-European examples with 41 descriptive fields. The fields describe, in some ways, the basic or standard characteristics of MSP processes, including their location, their area, their funding, and so on. But what the inventory also does is looks a little bit more about the quality of the processes that those MSP experiences went through. So looking at the maturity of the process, so how long they stayed in each stage of the MSP process, their governance approach, the planning tools they used, the stakeholder engagement techniques, and so on, and of course any cross-border collaboration or cooperation activities that they were involved in. I should just say that a lot of the effort we put in to expand and fill in the gaps in the database was focused around the cross-border collaboration. Just to build on something Damon said a few minutes ago, our interpretation of cross-border cooperation is important to recognize in the comments that are coming up in the rest of my slides. We interpreted cross-border to mean cooperation that exists between different jurisdictions. So just to spell out what that means, that's cooperation between countries, cooperation between hierarchical or nested systems within countries, and also cooperation between sectoral mandates where potentially there's no overarching authority, such as in areas beyond national jurisdiction or the high seas. The next slides will explain some of our results from the inventory, really just focusing on cross-border collaboration. So, of our 62 examples, the breakdown in terms of the type of cooperation that we found is shown on the screen. It was found essentially that 25 of the MSP processes exhibited some form of cross-border cooperation. That's 40% of the inventory. The multinational cooperation that we found in the 8 examples where there was some multinational cooperation, we found to be extremely variable. There wasn't really a standard approach that was undertaken to cooperation between countries. In some cases, there were formal legal requirements for cooperation that were embedded in the working practices of the MSP processes, such as in the ChemLAR area. In other cases, there were political agreements, and those form the driver of cooperation. For example, the Coral Triangle Plan of Action, or in other cases, memorandums of understanding between countries, which really provided the push for the cooperation. In other examples, there was the establishment of organizations between countries specifically to foster collaboration. And we framed this as in the establishment of social infrastructure. So social infrastructure we thought of as the working methods, the organizational structures, and the creation of opportunities that supported cooperation, but in no way were legal or formal in their structure. So an example might be the Association of Red Sea and Gulf of Aden MPA managers and scientists, which set up a kind of informal networking organization and body where they share their details and share data. And that is, in effect, an example of social infrastructure. In other places, the cooperation was really driven by on-the-ground activities. So people just getting together and actually trying things out and learning through doing, as was mentioned a few times yesterday. So what this shows is that there are multiple channels for marine spatial planning cooperation at a multinational scale, from the very formal to those shaped by social infrastructure and social norms. It also shows that there are a range of opportunities to support multinational MSP through existing organizations such as the regional seas bodies that Lisa described earlier today. At the subnational level, the picture was somewhat different. There was a much stronger emphasis on social infrastructure. And the sorts of social infrastructure we found to be very common were things like committees that fostered regular cooperation opportunities, such as the coastal advisory committees that were apparent in Belize, Forums and partnerships were much more common at the subnational level, which brought together groups of stakeholders and institutional representatives. So, for example, the Beaufort Sea, or the caucus that was established to support the Marine Planning Partnership, both in Canada. In many cases, there are also working groups established within those partnerships or within those committees to really focus on certain issues and drive forward on certain activities. It was interesting and notable that most subnational MSP processes were undertaken somewhat in isolation, in the sense that they often were taking place either before or after an MSP plan was in place in an adjacent area. And because of that, we really looked to see if there were connection points in those MSP processes to identify where they might join with an MSP process that might come along in the future to be its neighbour. However, we found that they were relatively scarce. So, in summary, the majority of cross-border cooperation in non-European MSP processes was at the subnational scale. It was generally supported by social infrastructure, not formal or legal structures, and the techniques used were extremely variable. This suggests in itself, of course, that cross-border cooperation is not uniform, and it suggests that as with many other aspects of marine spatial planning, the one-size-does-not-fit-all concept applies here as well. The evidence in the inventory also suggests that there is a wealth of cross-border practice from which MSP processes in Europe and elsewhere can learn, and that cross-border MSP is a little bit more common than we initially might think. So before I hand over to Stephen, there are a couple of final points that I'd like to make. There's a significant consideration around effectiveness. Effectiveness is generally thought to be context-specific, and to borrow something Joe Smith said yesterday, understanding MSP is understanding culture. Therefore, identifying patterns of cooperation is not the same as identifying effective cooperation. In this sense, the inventory has some constraints. So by combining several data sources that use different analytical frameworks, it was challenging to have one analytical framework through which to judge all of the examples in the inventory. Second, each of the data sources collected, recorded, and categorized their data slightly differently, which created certain inconsistencies that we had to deal with. And thirdly, and particularly in relation to cooperative activities in MSP processes, many processes simply don't collect information about how they cooperate. They certainly don't collect information about the effectiveness of cooperation or have indicators of effective cooperation. So there was a significant data gap in that sense. However, we used those observations to inform the second stage of the project, which is the 4 case studies. So learning from the inventory, we determined that a single analytical framework that was applied to all 4 case studies was fundamentally important, that framework needed to have clear evaluative criteria and measurable indicators, and that we needed to employ techniques that generated consistent evidence linked to the analytical framework, and that needed to be based on actually talking to people on the ground. So that's how we went forward. Damon's already touched on some of the rationale for the case studies. Just to build on that a little bit before I hand over to Stephen, the selection criteria for the case studies were very much focused around having examples with multi-sectoral goals where there is an approved marine spatial plan, and that those case studies should be spread across different sizes, different issues, and different governance contexts. And to those case studies, we would apply a single common analytical framework organized by something called the Orders of Outcome, which Stephen will talk about, and supported by site visits and detailed interviews. So on that note, I'll stop there and hand over to Stephen to describe in a bit more detail about the methodology. So, Stephen. Sorry, can't pick up my hair.
Are they stuck?
They're stuck.
Good morning, everybody. I'm going to say a few things more about the methods that we use for this analysis of the 4 case studies that you've already heard about. Clearly, a principal message from Steve is that jobs like this are much easier if you develop a common methodology, especially when you are looking at very, very different places, truly apples and oranges. You need to assess them by asking and answering a consistent set of questions, applying consistent standards, and having a conceptual framework that will embrace such diversity. The place that we began is that the tender of dg-mare and the proposal made by NIRAS called for a very broad set of topics that needed to be addressed. So the question was, how can we invent a common methodology that will do that will enable us to do that? And we chose the orders of outcomes in part because we were interested in digging through what really were the outcomes of each phase of an MSP process, phases that go on often for a decade, even more. How can we break that up into a sequence that leads in the direction of a common methodology? So the basic idea of the orders of outcomes is to identify a first set of outcomes, which are enabling conditions, basically that you have support, that you have commitment, that you have capacity, and you have clear goals. Then, as the MSP is being implemented, what's really changing? What human behaviors, because this is really all about managing people, what are the changes in behavior that signal that something is really happening, that something is changing? Thirdly, you get to the changes of state. Are the people happier? Are there more fish? Are the coral reefs feeling better? Those sorts of measures, which tend to be quite a long way off. You can only reach those usually at a small scale quickly. And then finally asking the question of, does all of this truly contribute to greater sustainability in this place? So you can summarize this system, and it gives you a framework which can be applied at any scale, which also means that you can track something, one MSP, as to what's happening locally, what's happening in some sub-area, what's happening in the place of the whole, and then very importantly, what's happening globally. As was said several times yesterday, the drivers are increasingly global, and MSP by definition is place-based. So there's an increasing, if you will, tension between what you can do in an individual MSP and how that affects, if at all, the larger forces of climate change, etc. The work was divided into 2 phases. One, to collect the information, understand the story of each of these cases, and we decided to divide things up by each order in terms of facts of the matter. How big, how much money, what are the issues, etc. Factual things. But where it really gets interesting is to what degree have the, for example, enabling conditions been put in place? To what degree is the behavior of resource users, of funders, of hopefully collaborating institutions. To what degree are they really changing? And to what degree are, for example, coral reefs getting better when globally the warming of the climate is pushing them all in the other direction to being less healthy? So the data collection was in those two forms. We had a total of maybe 20 to 25 facts of the matter, 40 to 50 standardized generic indicators probing the degree to which outcomes were being achieved at each order. We're now, okay, so here are a couple of examples of these graduated indicators. You can give each indicator a numerical rating. This is just to insert a discipline of thinking in a consistent manner across a diverse set of cases. But asking and answering these kinds of questions, above all, it's not the rating that you give something, it's the reason that you give it a rating that provides you with real insights into what's going on. Here's another example. So in all, there's between somewhat less than 50 of these kinds of questions organized by order. The result of all of this is we have very detailed, thought-provoking, very rich case studies, but that follow this consistent format so that you can really compare across them. And in the last several months, and we're still in it right now, is the comparative analysis to identify lessons learned and separate those that are specific to the context, which may be very, very important to that context, but of less value perhaps when thinking universally. What are good practices? What are the lessons? What recommendations emerge from all this? Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Stephen. And may I now introduce our next speaker, is Dominique Benzaken, who's a senior advisor of the Commonwealth Fund for Technical Cooperation, supporting currently the government of Seychelles. And she's going to be talking about context. Dominique.
Thanks, Damon, and good morning, everyone. So this presentation really moves really nicely from what the inventory says in terms of what you can say across a large number of examples to moving to in-depth analysis. And what I'm going to focus on is actually very specific ones. I'll actually focus on governance, drivers, and goals of MSP. So the approach that we took is actually looking at what the case studies tell us. The key questions we had is, how does governance context shape MSP process, and in particular cross-border collaboration? And the other one is how socioeconomic and environmental context shapes the scope of MSP, and this is more the driver and the objective of a particular case study. In terms of looking at how the context shapes the outcome, Stephen talked about that a little bit. I actually sort of thought that maybe we could leave that one out, because there's a lot of things that actually can impact on outcome that may be related to the MSP process, but there's other things that may not. And so I just thought that might be, I'll leave that for the moment. And the last point is to see what lessons learned from this analysis and what recommendation we could give the European Commission would be relevant, in particular in relation to the EC directive on MSP, and in specifically about what they call the interactions with third parties, but also based on this initiative that just was launched last year on international ocean governance, which actually has quite influenced how our study actually has evolved over time. Before moving a bit on the detail of what the case study tells us, and perhaps echoing on what was discussed this morning a little bit more, I just want to raise a few points of framing. And we're all very familiar with UNCLOS, and that's been for decades the main international legal instruments that tells us how to use the ocean space. But in recent times, oceans have actually picked up a lot more visibility in the international policy landscapes, in particular with the Sustainable Development Agenda, and speakers actually mentioned that very well this morning. So that actually creates a really interesting opportunity for ocean and for MSP. So is the UNFCCC Paris Agreement on climate change. There hasn't been any mention on MSP and climate change so far, but this is quite an important one because it actually brings in the concept of resilience, and that's very closely related to sustainable development. I can't read the board. That's terrible. Sorry, because I added that slide afterwards. The third one is talking about the international ocean governance, which obviously for us has meaning for the purpose of its study, because that's one of the objectives of this work, to actually advise and provide recommendation. As was mentioned this morning, there's a specific action there to look at the promotion of MSP, Action 10, which is. But there's also an interesting development as well, is how MSP can actually be a tool for global and regional governance. And this morning there was some good discussion about regional governance. I think, as was said this morning, whilst the global governance is really important, the implementation is probably more likely, and for MSPs must be more relevant at that regional level. And obviously, this is where MSP as a tool has obviously a lot of value to look at cross-border collaboration. So in a way, what is very interesting in this recent development is that the status of MSP as a tool is actually elevated and can actually have a much greater impact than it has had in the past. In terms of the governance context, which is the first context that we look at, are just some of the very basic definitions that we use to think about governance, was the body of laws, policies, and institutions and processes that govern decision-making about the protection and use of oceans. What is good governance? That's a good question. I think it's got to have an element of legitimacy, transparency, and accountability, and inclusiveness, and there's been already quite a few discussions on that. So now when we look at our case studies, we can see that there is a range of governance arrangement, MSP process, and cross-border collaboration. By looking at those case studies in more depth, we can also look at some assumptions that we may have had on what is good practice for MSP. And so I think it's quite a useful tool to actually look at having a very in-depth analysis of case study as opposed to what we normally do, which is inventory-based. It also highlights some of the contextual elements which will facilitate MSP development and implementation. So what are we talking about? If we look at the evidence from the case study, what is emerging? In terms of governance and MSP processes, obviously the legal basis is really an important feature of most of the case studies, whether we're talking about responsible institution, mandates, in the development or the implementation of MSP. So that's actually something to really look at. The other one is what I call history of joint decision-making. And that's to say that when there is a history of planning together or working together and making decisions together between institutions, this actually accelerates how MSP is going to actually be happening. The other one is also, which is an important one, and in some cases it worked, or it's sort of not so much in other cases, or at least it's a challenge that we all know. Because MSP is a place-based process, how do you link this to sector-based decision-making, which is very often not place-based based. So that's an important one. The other factor that emerges also in terms of governance is the issue of political culture. What I mean by that is maybe to some extent what I call the big P politics, which is what we understand by politics, or the small p politics, which is more the politics of decision making. Who makes the decision? How does that work? And there's some really good example that you can look at in the case study, particularly if you contrast, for example, the Xiamen example in China and the Rhode Island example. There's very good, interesting differences that you can look at, and it will be presented to you in a subsequent presentation. The other one is about sovereignty and geopolitics, and this is obviously more relevant to transnational sort of situation. The very interesting case studies that we have, CTI and Camilla, are interesting and very different. One will start by a voluntary partnership in CTI where no governance mechanism existed for that particular area, to a very formalized mechanism with Camilla that's been there for a long time and has a very codified way of making decisions. So how does these different types of governance structures influence the MST process? Obviously, how cross-border collaboration will be a function of how those governance mechanism actually works. It will also affect transparency also, and in particular how information is actually available to feed into those processes. It also impacts on stakeholder engagement, which can take very different forms, and we sort of take it for granted that we'll have the participation of civil society in those processes or non-government, but the way in which this is happening is not necessarily as we would expect. And I think the China example is actually very interesting from that point of view, and you'll hear about that later. And obviously, the importance of the legal basis is compliance and enforcement. Oh, 6 minutes. Okay, so lessons learned there. The main one, I think, is, and that's been said before, is one size does not fit all. So it is important that the MSP process actually is very mindful of those contexts, and there is built into the design and the implementation some flexibility and responsiveness, because issues evolve over time. So you may start with a set of goals and objectives, but they may change over time. So that's a really important one. And so the governance mechanism needs to be adaptable from that point of view. The other one, and I think that's the assumption that, the implicit assumption that we made, is that MSP is a political process, whether we're talking about larger geopolitical issues in transnational situation, or more looking at within one jurisdiction what's going on in terms of decision making. These are really important aspects. The other thing, too, is MSP can be initiated for a number of scale of decision-making, but usually it includes several scales of decision-making. So you can start from different points, but you may end up in the same place. The other one is the importance of building on existing mechanism as much as possible and build and value add on these existing mechanisms, if that's possible, as much as possible. And obviously the other one is to look at how you harmonize across spatial and non-spatial planning processes and decision making. The second part of my talk is about drivers and goals, and that's how the socio-economic context or environmental context actually influence the goal setting and the drivers. There's actually two major trends, and they've actually been picked up already in discussion. One is looking at MSP as a tool for blue growth or blue economy, depending how you want to characterize it. And there you'd see that the primary driver is actually economics. And often it's about looking at user conflicts or population pressure, or looking at new economic opportunities, getting resource optimization. The China example is very good at that. And in most cases, all of those are actually associated with a driver which is environmental, and it's about declining environmental quality, loss of amenity, and sustainability issue. And the other aspects of MSP, which has been mentioned before, is as a tool for ocean health. And there, the primary driver is environmental, and it's about how do you protect marine ecosystems through MPS system networks or other mechanisms, and also how you reduce threats to ocean health, and the application of ecosystem-based approach, and there'll be a presentation specifically dedicated to that. So in terms of drivers and goals, what can we learn from those case studies? The first one is we could look at whether MSP is a tool for sustainable development, and we've had before quite a few discussions on that, and I think there's an agreement there. The interesting thing is, whether you look at economic drivers as the primary sort of mechanism for MSP, like it was in the Rhode Island example with offshore wind, in the end, you find that the goals are actually quite balanced across environmental, social, and economic goals. So that's an interesting sort of lesson to think about. The other one is to look at, under that broad sort of MSP as a tool for sustainable development, is the issue of certainty. Having a plan, which is a statutory plan, that has clarity on who does what and who decides on what, is actually what private sector looks for investing. And this issue of certainty is actually quite an important one. The last one is about resource mobilization for MSP implementation. There hasn't been a lot of discussion. Well, there's been identification that this is a key issue for MSP implementation in just about all the case studies. But at the same time, how do you go about addressing that financial gap? And there's a very big sort of global discussion at the moment, which is about leveraging private sector investment. And this is not the purpose of this particular conference, but it's something to keep in mind. And the last point that I wanted to make is about the scale of decision making and whether that's got anything to do with drivers and goals. Whether you look at national or transnational about the scope of MSP, one thing that we found quite interesting is the CTI, both the CTI and the CAMELA have a very strong environmental focus in contrast with what you see in the Rhode Island and the Xiamen sort of examples. So is that something to think about as something that's actually important to consider? This is what the case study say, and this is something that I leave as an open question. And thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dominique. May I now invite to the stage our next speaker, who's going to be discussing our first case study. This is Jennifer McCann, who is the Director of the US Coastal Programs at the University of Rhode Island's Coastal Resources Center. And talking with her will be Gonzalo Cañero, who's a Senior Consultant and Evaluation Specialist at NIRAS in Sweden.
Thank you very much, and thank you for this opportunity to present to you about our work in Rhode Island. Rhode Island, I'm from Rhode Island, and we have the longest name. We are Rhode Island and the Providence Plantations, yet we are the smallest state. We were the first of the 13 colonies to declare independence from England, and we were also the last to ratify the Constitution. So we have a little bit of vinegar in our water, in our blood, I believe. So we are the ocean state. That is our nickname. And because much of our economy, much of our recreational activities, and much of our history and culture comes from the ocean. And that's really important to us. Our ocean, our offshore waters are very important to us. In 2007, our governor proposed that the state of Rhode Island develop offshore renewable energy, so the siting of offshore wind turbines off of our coast. This was the map that was shared by the governor using the best available information at the time. And he also encouraged the facilitation of a stakeholder process, which entailed a few meetings by key stakeholders. And the intent was to put 200 offshore wind turbines within the study area. A little bit about this area is We have a 3 nautical miles is our state boundary. That's where our state government can plan and regulate. And then we have our study area became about 30 nautical miles offshore. The blue blobs on this map identify where the potential sites for these 200 offshore wind turbines were going to be proposed. The island in the middle is called Block Island. According to the Nature Conservancy, it's considered one of the last great places in the world. And again, our economy, such as our coastal tourism, as well as our fishing industry, we have one of the largest ports in the country here, are in this area. So you can imagine, not only were the communities, the industries, were really concerned, the environmental organizations were very concerned about what is the governor doing? Why are we considering putting offshore wind turbines in our waters? Again, there were no offshore wind turbines in the United States at that time. Why should Rhode Island mess up our waters? So an approach that Rhode Islanders were very comfortable with was an approach called the SAMP, a Special Area Management Plan. It's recognized in our Federal Coastal Zone Management Act, and I call it a tool with teeth. It can be a regulatory tool. Many people use it as a guidance document, but we in Rhode Island have used it as a regulatory tool. The intent of a SAMP is to use the best available science. It's also to keep Rhode Islanders, whether they be the fishermen or the regulatory agencies, in the driver's seat. We get to decide what happens in our waters. It's also, throughout our process, we developed specific principles. And the purpose of these principles was to build trust and a commitment that this process was going to be transparent and it was going to honor the concerns and issues of researchers, of fishermen, of the Marine Trades Institute organizations, as well as the tribes. It was also, we were hoping, it was going to be an opportunity to streamline the regulatory process. As I mentioned, we had state waters, we also have federal waters. And we have a lot of rules and regulations in the United States. So many people say, well, this was a state project. But the fact of the matter is, we were required formally to work with federal entities, whether it be from in Washington, D.C. to the tribes. I'm going on and on and on about this. So it was very important. We worked with the Coast Guard, for example, to work on transportation, with the Navy on military aspects, fisheries, and whatnot. And so during our process, the most important thing for our collaboration was to make sure that this SAMP process responded to the issues and the concerns and the requirements of all of these agencies. So we sat down and we talked to them. What are your needs? What kind of data do you need? What kind of information do you need, and how do you need it? So that when they stepped in at the end to do environmental impact statements, they were able to apply the ocean SAMP information. This also, we sat down with the fishermen to find out what information they were requiring. They were really concerned about this, as well as with the offshore wind industry, to say, what information did you need? We also had an amazing leader within our coastal program, Grover Fugate, who recognized that this was an effort that needed to be supported by all, and that we could do it, but we need to be innovative and creative. And from Grover came other leaders within the industry, within the tribal entities, within the researchers, who really recognized that we can't mess this up, that we need to do it right, not only for Rhode Islanders, but also for, as an example, here in the United States. This is a graph that sort of summarizes our process. What I like to demonstrate here is if you look at sort of the orange boxes and then the lighter lime green boxes, you see that we have stakeholder involvement as well as researcher involvement in every aspect of the process. We forced the scientists to talk to the people, okay? We forced the regulators, whether they be the federal people or the state, to talk to the people. And therefore, it was a real eye-opener to see the way these people were interacting continuously. So people started to get to know each other and understand where their kids go to school, but also what are the concerns that they have out there. And so there are these relationships being built. So not only do we have this formal process, we had an informal process. We had 13 chapters in our ocean stamp process and in our ocean stamp document, and a long process. Each chapter went through about 8 phases, and all the phases on one side, from 1 to 4, were the informal process. We didn't start the formal process until step 5. So it was very important for people to interact, for regulators to interact with fishermen, et cetera, and to come up with solutions informally so that then the formal process could then be moved much more efficiently. You've seen the map of the blue blobs, we call it. We brought a lot of science into the process, thinking about the geology. Clearly, you're not going to pile drive in on hard bottoms. You need a certain bottom for pile driving offshore wind turbines. You need to go out as far as you can, as much as possible. But you also need to understand where the unexploded ordnances are, where the Navy identifies, or where the navigational channels, both the formal and informal. And as you can see from this science, from this information, a lot of the existing or the first proposed sites were completely taken off the map. And when we started sharing this information with the public, you could just feel the tension. Again, there was still concern, but there was less tension in the process because they realized that we were using science. We were involving the people, again, whether they be tribal people, fishermen, environmental organizations, federal agencies, into the process. This is an example. We worked with the marine trades industry. We are the sailing capital of the world, or so we tell ourselves. And this is an example of how we use our waters for sailboat racing. So the marine trades industry participated in this process, and we created areas of particular concern. In other words, in these areas that are of value, of significance to the marine industry, if a developer, whether they be an LNG developer or offshore renewable energy developer, if you want to develop in those sites, well, you better put a lot of money down and expect a long process, because these areas are of value to the people of Rhode Island, both economically as well as culturally. Another example in the federal situation is, so working with the fishermen, I'm sure many of you have experienced, the fishermen said, we fish all over the place, okay? There's no place you want to put a wind turbine because we fish all over this place. Well, when the federal government, BOEM, said, well, we're going to use, based on the ocean stamp information, we're going to be using, putting these lease blocks out here in federal waters, again, the states, whether it be Massachusetts, which is abutting us, as well as Rhode Island, and again, we had lots of consultations, discussions with them, some successful, some not successful. We had an MOU that was created between Rhode Island and Massachusetts for this area of mutual interest area, and basically we agreed that we would cooperate with promoting offshore renewable energy in this area. The fishermen came to us and said, hey, there's a lot of important fishing areas in this area, one called Cox's Ledge, for example. And our state agency said, our governor doesn't want us to complain about this because we have an agreement with Massachusetts that we will partner on promoting offshore renewable energy in here, potentially 200 wind turbines. So we worked with the fishermen, however, to identify where are the areas of most of most value to the fishermen. And those are the sort of the hotter colors, the red and the orange colors. Again, the governor would not submit this to the federal government because there was an agreement, there would be cooperation. But we, through the Ocean SAMP, we had developed some advisory boards that had recognition. This one was called the Fishermen's Advisory Board. The Fishermen's Advisory Board then submitted this to the federal government, and because of support and collaboration and discussion, the federal government agreed to take those lease blocks off the table. And so this facilitated the Deepwater Wind to secure the lease blocks and allowing them to construct, and they will be constructing around 100 to 200 offshore wind turbines. And this, to some degree, at this point looks like it's being supported by the environmental organizations, by the fishermen, and by the tribes, as well as the federal government and the state agencies, because there's a constant conversation. We have a Fishermen's Advisory Board next week. We have a Habitat Advisory Board next week. We continually meet with these individuals so they're informed of the monitoring that's happening and also of the activity that's going on here. So we continue to use the Ocean SAMP. The Ocean SAMP was adopted formally at the federal level in 2011. We're in the process of incorporating information on sand and gravel mining. And in some, we were able to facilitate this process so that there was cross-boundary collaboration, successful cross-boundary collaboration, so that we were able to increase the protection of environmental, cultural, economic areas, which was about 60% of the study area. So we were able to integrate or improve that. We were also able to streamline the regulatory process. There's a reason why Rhode Island's the first place in the United States that has an offshore wind farm. And the industry says it's because of the Ocean SAMP. It costs the industry a lot less money to do this than in any other ways. It was also able to promote renewable energy industry. We had a renewable energy zone as well. This just didn't start just in 2007. I think what the gentleman for the Netherlands said, this takes a long time. We've been doing in Rhode Island coastal management for over 30 years now, starting to some degree with Stephen Olson when he was a young lad. So we've been working on coastal management, on marine spatial planning, we didn't call it that, for over 30 years. So that relationship building is pretty strong many times, and I think that's really important to not only create a strong support for these plans, not only within the communities, but also in the federal and state government. So I'm going to pass that off to Gonzalo.
Thank you, Jen. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. I'm just going to share with you some reflections across the 4 case studies on how collaboration participation in MSP processes has been addressed. And I have no slides, so I'll just share some thoughts. And at risk of stating the obvious, looking across the studies we've done, it appears that the process for engaging stakeholders in MSP processes, well, it needs to be tailored to the historical and governance context, and also to the expectations of the stakeholders in terms of how much and when they participate. Let me just sort of explore the nuances of success with respect to these different aspects. Thinking of historical context, we had one particular case that we explored, the CTI, in a context of the countries not, or in an absence of a mechanism for, or in history of the countries collaborating in marine spatial planning. A great investment was made in building that structure that enabled the countries to start working together, starting building something together. So to say that had not been for that investment, then the MSP process would not have happened. In terms of the governance context, well, we all know it shapes or it determines what the different actors must do and how much they can do with respect to involving different actors. And there again we see a large diversity in the sample that we have studied. from cases like Rhode Island, where there is a direct engagement of different types of stakeholders in the planning process, to other cases where non-governmental stakeholders are only engaged through government agencies, for example. In all those cases, things appear to have worked given the context they took place in. An important aspect related to the governance context is also the ability of the capacity of the different actors to engage in the process. And there again, we have seen, in particular in the CTI, that it has been very beneficial to invest effort in transferring or in capacity building from the more capable partners to the less capable ones, so as to bring everyone to a sort of a minimum level of ability to engage in the process in a meaningful way. So again, that is an investment that, as we have seen in our cases, is worth making. Regarding expectations of stakeholders, what the Rhode Island case illustrates very clearly is the need to build or construct a stakeholder engagement process that addresses how much stakeholders expect to be involved, but also the ability that they have to influence the process through legal means, among others. Now, we've seen that is very different. These two abilities are very different in the sample we have studied, and again, so we have cases where stakeholders engaged only through government agencies, and that's fine. We have others, like as Rhode Island, where that would not have been possible. And the process would have not gone forward. The degree also to which, and again, the Rhode Island case study is very, very eloquent on that, the degree to which stakeholders want to be engaged or expect to be engaged is also determined by what the plan intends to do and what type of plan it is. So and that's sort of from the perspective of stakeholders, is it looking at, is how much is this plan going to affect me and my activity? And that is we've seen is a prime driver for stakeholders to engage or not engage. So again, across this diversity, or what we have seen is that this diversity of approaches to engaging stakeholders works according to context. So the message is maybe a rather non-innovative one, and that is go out, understand context, and design your stakeholder engagement process accordingly. What we have seen, and that's probably the second message I would like to leave you here with, is that other than just ticking the box of stakeholder process completed and abiding by the regulation to do that, if there's any, stakeholder engagement process is about building trust, building a constituency of individuals or leaders who are sort of convinced or built into driving the MSP process further. Thank you very much. That was it.
Thank you very much, Jen and Gonzalo. And in our last talk before lunch, may I now introduce Dr. Mark Belcher from the British Antarctic Survey, who's also the chair of the Scientific Committee on the Commission for the Conservation of Antarctic Marine Living Resources, and also Hannah Thomas, who is from the UN Environment World Conservation Monitoring Centre.
Good morning, everybody. In our study of cross-border MSP, we looked particularly at the application of the ecosystem approach. And as you've heard earlier today and yesterday, MSP is an ecosystem-based approach. We also heard earlier Ji-Hun Lee from the CBD Secretariat stating that CBD members have agreed that MSP is a tool that can deliver the ecosystem approach. So it's very important that we're absolutely clear about what we mean by an ecosystem approach and the relative terms that are used. So essentially what we're describing here is the philosophy of the ecosystem approach is really a shift from single issue or single species management towards a broader ecosystem management, so that the system itself, the ecological system, which is why we hear particular terms like the ecosystem approach to fisheries. It can be done within a particular sector. And then broadening that out even further, we can see how cross-sectorally we can join together management systems, which really leads us to what we can call ecosystem-based management, which is true cross-sectoral management of ecological systems. If we can think, therefore, about individual sectors can operate, have their own management systems, each one of those sectors and sectoral governance systems can apply the ecosystem approach. But when we really think about ecosystem-based management, we're thinking about applying it all together. There are a number of principles that really embody the ecosystem approach. We really need to think about the boundaries being defined by the ecosystem rather than by geopolitical or administrative boundaries. And what we're really trying to do is to understand that humans are an integral part of the ecosystem, and therefore we're managing for multiple ecosystem benefits: fisheries and renewable energy sources, healthy oceans, biodiversity. But likewise, we really need not just to think about the impacts of individual sectors, but the cumulative impacts across all of those activities and how they're going to impact upon the ecosystem. One of the core principles, as we've heard numerous times already, is that we must use the best available science in terms of specific scientific data, but also information, stakeholder information, local community understanding of the ecosystem. And when we say best available, we really mean don't wait. Don't wait for perfect information. We must make decisions right now so that we don't miss out on future situations, or we don't misunderstand the impacts of particular management actions. When having said we need to use the best available science, we need to know that where there are gaps in information or where there are areas of uncertainty, we need to apply the precautionary approach so that management actions are careful. And then we need to manage adaptively. We need to understand the impacts of those management actions and change our approach on a regular basis. So we can see that the ecosystem approach is particularly important for cross-border marine spatial planning, particularly because you can consider an ecosystem at multiple scales. But when we're really thinking about multiple ecosystem services, the size of the ecosystem that we're really going to be looking at is relatively large. And when we also want to be considering the connections between ecosystems, the scale is going to get even larger. So it's going to be essential that there is collaboration and cooperation between nation states, between governance systems, between entities, to be able to capture that scale. Equally, we now understand that the impacts of our activities range far and wide. Climate change is an excellent example. It's a global problem. So we need to really be thinking on those large scales in terms of applying the ecosystem approach. And particularly for this audience here, the EC's blue growth, it's being applied at sea basin scales, which is absolutely matches the direction of the ecosystem approach. So what we're really saying is that the ecosystem approach is a fundamental core principle of blue growth. We must apply the ecosystem approach to have sustainable development. I'd now like to hand over to Dr. Mark Belcher, who's going to give an example of how ecosystem-based management occurs in CAMLR and the Southern Ocean. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Hannah, and good afternoon, everybody. This is a different audience to the one that I'm usually used to talking about CAMLR to. So I think it'd be worthwhile just reflecting on a little bit of history and geography. It's been quite evident from some of the presentations that I've seen so far that the Southern Ocean and areas south of 60 tend to get neglected and drop off the bottom of maps. So perhaps if we could move on to the next slide. This is my view of the world, which is quite different to a lot of the other projections of the globe that we've seen so far. But I think it's worth highlighting, firstly, that when CAMLR was established 35 years ago, the ecosystem approach to fisheries management and environmental management was absolutely at the core of everything that it does. but it's also relevant in this discussion because of the relationship between CAMLAR as an organization that works with many different members, but also has to consider issues that are happening to the north of the convention area. So slightly confusingly, CAMLAR stands for the Commission for the Conservation of Antarctic Marine Living Resources, but it also synonymously is also applied to the Convention, which should in fact have an extra C in the front. It sits underneath the Antarctic Treaty System, which when that was signed in 1959 explicitly referred to land areas south of 60 degrees, but with very little mention actually of the marine environment. So when CAMLAR came along in 1982, following many years of tough negotiations, it then was integrated within the ATS, the Antarctic Treaty System, to cover not just those areas of the marine environment south of 60 degrees, but also realizing that biogeographically, the Southern Ocean extended a lot further north than 60 degrees. And so the northerly boundary was set in terms of the ecosystem, so it became the Antarctic Circumpolar Current, or the Polar Front, or the Convergence. It's got many synonyms. Now, CAMLAR doesn't like to think of itself as an RFMO, and in fact, we refer to ourselves, or it refers to itself as a conservation body, but it does indeed fulfill many of the roles of a regional fisheries management organization. You'll see from this figure here, it might be a bit difficult to see, that the jurisdiction or the boundary of CAMLAR, certainly to the north, maps almost exactly with that of the mean location of the Antarctic Circumpolar Current, which, as I'll return to later, set in stone the northern boundary at the time in 1982. Clearly, if climate effects change the mean position of that boundary, then I think it would be appropriate to consider whether the northern boundary as is still appropriate. The other thing on this figure is that I'd like to highlight is that it's an enormous area. It's about 32 million square kilometers that covers at least three large ocean basins. And that is sort of equal to the size of the US and Europe together. But it is, as we saw earlier on from other presentations, often not considered or dropped off and neglected. But it's a vast area which makes management in a very, very hostile area and data collection doubly difficult. So why did CAMLAR come about? Well, this figure, I think, captures quite clearly why CAMLAR came about. And it arose through growing concerns, largely from scientists, but also from those responsible for the Southern Ocean at the time, that the unchecked growth in the exploitation of Antarctic krill, which was the cornerstone species for the Southern Ocean, if left unchecked, would have a massive detrimental impact on the entire ecosystem which depended upon it. And you see the krill fishery trajectory here is the solid line, and you can see that in the late 1970s there was a massive increase in activity, largely by a former Soviet fishing fleet. And what they didn't want a repeat of was the picture that's shown here for some of the finfish fisheries, which are the bar charts here, which show a sort of sequential exploitation of the marine resources of the Southern Ocean, leading to the commercial extinction of a number of species within a very short period of time. And this was on top of the major degradation to the environment that had taken place over a couple of hundred years by removing vast numbers of Antarctic fur seals from the convention area, and then followed by the well-documented near extermination of all of the large whales. So around the middle of the 1970s, scientists really concerned about the likely impact of continued krill fishing thought we have to do something about this, and CAMLAR was formed. And very explicitly from the outset, the aims were not just to act as an RFMO to manage the krill fishery, but very explicitly in the articles of the convention were that the aim of CAMLAR was to conserve marine life in the Southern Ocean, but it doesn't exclude sustainable harvesting, as long as that is carried out in a rational manner. And it also defines the living resources. So that means with populations of the fishes, mollusks, crustaceans, and all the other species of living organisms, including the birds that are found south of the polar front. Now, interestingly, at the time, there were other conventions that are still in place that governed the management of seals and whales, and we're all familiar with the IWC, perhaps not so much with the Convention on the Management of Antarctic Seals. Whilst CAMLR doesn't have a remit to provide management advice on these species, it's clearly they are important parts of the ecosystem, so have to be considered in the ecosystem-based approach to management, which does require interactions with those other bodies. There are many, many articles of the Convention. I think there are over 30. But the one that is most relevant to the way that CAMLR operates is Article 2, and it's here synthesized a little. But I think it's very important that in Article 2, it clearly sets out what at the time wasn't called the ecosystem-based approach to management, but it's explicitly that is what this is. So you see here that firstly, there should be we need to prevent a decrease in the size of the harvested populations to levels below those which ensure stable recruitment in the future. And this, importantly, I think speaks to a lot of what's been discussed here. B here is to maintain the ecological relationship between harvested, dependent and related populations of Antarctic marine living resources and the restoration of those resources that have been depleted. And then lastly, in C here, it actually sets a time frame of 2 to 3 decades by which any impact should be reversed. CAMLR also from the outset made it very clear that it was going to operate by using the best available science, so that members must take full account of the best scientific information available to the scientific committee in the formulation, adoption and revision of the conservation measures. And these are the legally binding documents by which members of the CAMLR Convention must abide by. It also recognises that it's a massive ecosystem. There are bound to be gaps and uncertainties, and these must also be considered in the decision-making process. So CAMLR has an explicit mandate to take both a precautionary approach to ecosystem-based management whilst allowing rational use of living resources. So I'll now take a little time to show some practical examples where this has been implemented. And I think one of those that's very well known is the success that CAMLR has had in reducing seabird, particularly petrel and albatross mortality in longline fisheries, to close to zero. In all areas south of 60 degrees, there's been a total ban on the use of all bottom trawl gear, and that also applies in many of the EEZ regions north of the 60 degrees as well. There are very strict catch limits for bycatch and also move-on rules for bycatch, which prevent fishermen locally depleting bycatch species. There are spatial closures in place that are triggered by other taxa, benthic taxa, sponges, corals, for example, coming up on fishing gear. Those areas can be closed off for the future. And more recently, since probably the early 2000s, and probably culminating in the first MPA declaration in 2009 for the South Orkneys, there's been development of large-scale MPAs within the CAMLR zone. And I think one of the other things that's often ignored as well is the fact that CAMLR operates 100% observer coverage now on all fishing vessels, scientific observers, providing very high-resolution, high-quality data by which the scientific committee can make its decisions. So, although I've talked a lot about fisheries, actually CAMLR has implemented MSP across the whole area, and there are various examples here. The light blue there represents marine protected areas. There are special research zones. There are the EEZs of some of the member states up to the northern boundary of the polar front, and there are also special research areas with limited krill fishing and toothfish fishing within. Spatial planning is still something that takes up an awful lot of our time and considerations at CAMLR, particularly the development of marine protected areas. And you'll see from the figure on the side there, most of you will probably be aware that a very large MPA was declared after many years of negotiation in the Ross Sea at the 2016 meeting in October. And there are also plans to look at some of the other very large basin scale areas for the development of MPAs, particularly the Weddell Sea at the moment. But MPAs also exist within the EEZs of the member states located around the sort of peri-Antarctic region. And this is just highlighting that actually this did give CCAMLR an awful lot of exposure this year, but it was a very, very slow process to get to that point. However, we face a number of challenges. The first of which is that a lot of our research is dedicated towards toothfish species now, and these are not constrained to the area south of the polar front. So we need to consider broadening our horizons and engaging with those RFMOs to the north for straddling stock management of these resources. We know that our predators forage way beyond the convention area, and this has led to problems with seabird mortality in pelagic tuna fisheries, for example, birds that actually nest within the convention area. I think this is very important. The organisation, CCAMLR, works by consensus. And trying to get consensus across 25 members, which actually the EU operates as a member, can be very, very time-consuming and laborious and a lot of late nights. And CCAMLR currently only applies to Antarctic marine living resources, so other sectors such as tourism and mineral extraction are covered by other agreements, normally under the Antarctic Treaty System. It's a huge area to operate in, roughly 10% of the world's oceans, and that in itself has logistical problems for data collection. And I think really acutely in the Southern Ocean is that climate impacts are likely to have a big effect on the way that CCAMLR operates in the future, and it's a particularly vulnerable environment to climate change. So I will leave it there and hand over briefly again to my double act partner, to Hannah. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Mark. I just want to give a few reflections on the application of the ecosystem approach across the 4 case studies, much as Gonzalo did with the last presentation. Interestingly, CCAMLR is one of the best examples of the application of the ecosystem approach. But even within CCAMLR, we could see that all 4 case studies found that there was no uniform understanding of what the ecosystem approach really means. That either can be, for example, in the Coral Triangle Initiative, where the 6 countries had very different appreciations of what that would mean, but also within CCAMLR, when the 25 members themselves differ in terms of their appreciation of how complicated or complex the approach should be. So we do need to address our common understanding. Adaptive management is a key principle, as I said earlier, of the ecosystem approach. And that really means that we need to have the data and the information and the monitoring and the evaluation to support adaptive management. But what our case study showed was that doesn't need to be complicated. That can be very simple. We really need to move towards our goal, whatever our goal is. What we did see was that the Coral Triangle Initiative and CCAMLR are both very clearly delineated by their ecosystems. Their boundaries are very obviously ecosystem-based. But the other 2 were less so, and from all of the discussions we've had so far, it's very clear that if we are defining MSP within an EEZ, that's a geopolitical and administrative boundary. We really need to be thinking about how we collaborate with neighbours in order to extend out to the boundaries of the relative ecosystem. Similarly, as Mark was mentioning, tourism is less well developed in CCAMLR's decision-making, and we also found that across the case studies. There are several examples of where many of the activities that are impacting those ecosystems are simply not included in the plan in the sense that there is no management decision-making. But there are many ways in which those activities can be incorporated or taken into account. But still, if we're thinking about ecosystem-based management being completely cross-sectoral, I think we'll find lots of examples where that simply isn't the case for very obvious reasons. So across our case studies, really the conclusion is that implementation of the full set of principles is very rare indeed. It's extremely challenging for us to deliver what is essentially a philosophy, a concept with principles that guide us, but that are difficult to implement, particularly in any one MSP process. So what we need what we need to think about, and what we certainly saw from our case studies, was that there are many other governance systems that sit alongside or in parallel to individual MSP processes. And we really need to be mindful of how those linkages can be strengthened, because it's the collection of those governance systems that's really going to deliver the ecosystem approach, not any single process itself. So just to conclude, I'll leave you with these key points. The ecosystem approach is essential as a concept to deliver blue growth, but really it's a huge challenge. We need to be making ecosystem-based decisions that take us beyond the uncertainty, move through uncertainty, and we need to strengthen the cooperation and coordination between the governance systems that will collectively deliver the ecosystem approach. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mark and Hannah. And in fact, thank you very much to all the speakers for the sessions. If the questions have come up through the course of these presentations, please do log in, either download the app or use login online onto Slido. If there's any questions you want to ask, please do put them in, because after lunch we'll use that as the form of a discussion afterwards. So thank you very much. See you at 1:30.